All right, so today I wanted to go into the vegetative propagation of orchids. So real quick, vegetatively propagating plants is the same thing as cloning them. You basically make a plant out of a part of an already existent plant without having to go through the process of gametogenesis, fertilization, embryo formation, and all that jazz. There are advantages and disadvantages to this method. The obvious advantage would be conserve whatever trait of interest in the plant that you propagate vegetatively is. There are some plants that are really difficult to propagate vegetatively, and there are many plants that are easy to propagate vegetatively. If you really want to have diversity in your plant collection, you really want to go the sexual method, but the asexual method of reproducing plants is a very simplistic method to use. There are some plants that can be very difficult to induce to flower in culture, and if you want to make more of them, it makes more sense to vegetatively reproduce them. Also, in many cases, vegetative reproduction gives you a mature plant in a shorter period of time because you're starting with more plant material. So we're going to talk a little bit about these sorts of things. The simplest and easiest way to asexually reproduce an orchid would be to divide it. Orchids that have very prominent pseudobulbs, such as a lot of your Oncidium orchids, cattleyas are also this way. You can see all of the pseudobulbs in this cattleya. This cattleya type orchid, I don't know exactly what it is. I kind of broke it off of a plant that was growing in someone's greenhouse. Anyway, but you see the roots are intact on it right there. It's almost like a triangular, like lily seed pod shaped pseudobulb that I broke off, and it has its own roots, it has its own leaf, and this is its own independent plant, and it will grow more pseudobulbs as it develops. The dendrobium canes are doing the same sort of thing. If you look at my plants out here, you could very easily divide this really dense bundle of dendrobium into about a dozen or so other plants if you really wanted to. Each one would be a single cane with some roots, and over time that would grow. Plants such as Maxillaria, which I have over here, these pseudobulbs kind of stack on each other. Here's the pseudobulb, here's the pseudobulb, here's the pseudobulb, and you can break off pieces of this as the plant grows, and underneath all this brown is already preformed roots that will expand away from the plant as needed. So what you would do with something like Maxillaria and a lot of the other pseudobulb formers, as you can see here, this plant initially kind of looked like this, where you have this back bulb which doesn't have any leaves on it, and its primary function is for storage of nutrients and other materials. And then you have a photosynthetic productive bulb that has the, pseudobulb that has the leaf attached to it where new growth will come out of. And so you start off with, a piece of maxillaria that has one of each of these. Maybe you want two back bulbs if you want it to grow faster, but you don't need that. And you'll just let the plant grow from that. And with this, you would break off a piece and you would let the roots emerge before you do anything else with it. Cymbidium will produce back bulbs that themselves can just be separated from the plant and propagated out. The cymbidium in the back there, I broke from a living, growing pseudobulb on an established plant in the greenhouse, and it's its own plant. Division is a really quick and easy way of making one orchid into multiple orchids. Now, obviously, if you have a large orchid and you want to see it bloom, you might not want to divide it into smaller pieces, because when you divide it into smaller pieces, you basically produce plants that are developmentally set back a little bit. And when you do that, you have to wait a little bit longer to actually see flowers, such as with this Oncidium here. Other things you can do with some orchids is take stem cuttings, just like you would for pothos or any other plant that you want to root. Some of the jewel orchids, like the Ludicea, are very easy to do that with. You just cut off a fleshy section and you sit it on the top of some soil, and its roots will form quite readily. Vanilla bean is another orchid that you can do this with. Other orchids may not be as easy to get to do that. For example, you probably can't cut off part of this and get it to roots, unless you induce it, and that would be a little bit advanced. Another thing that orchids will do is they will form what are called kekkis. A lot of things like epidendrum and dendrobium and phalaenopsis do this. A kekki is a baby plant growing off of the main stem of the parent plant. We have a parent plant here. This was actually started from a kekki, by the way. And this is Epidendrum secundum. And you can see it's got a kekki. It's this fully formed baby plant with all of its roots. And when I wish, I can break this off of the parent plant and pot it up in its own pot, and it will be its own plant. Kekkis, you can induce them with something called kekki paste, where it just has different hormones to force kekkis to form along the stem of an orchid. With some orchids, you don't really need to do that. They just kind of do it on their own as they grow. Dendrobiums do this a lot. Some people say it's a sign that you're watering them too much. It really depends on the species in that case. There are some plants that are more prone to doing that. And obviously in the wild, the kekki would be good because if the plant gets disturbed too much and the kekki falls off, you can establish somewhere else. This is a terrestrial... Why is this leaf so, like, chubby? Look at that. Anyway, that is really cool. I did not know. Anyway, so you don't want to remove a kekki until it has decent roots so it can grow on as its own plant. Some people just leave them. You can take them off. You can give them to friends, whatever. I'm just going to let this thing be for a little bit. If I wanted to break it off later, I will. And that's basically what a kekki is. I love things that make kekkis. My Dendrobium kingianum has a kekki bud that looks like it's splitting in two, so there might be two kekkis from one little bud. Really cool stuff. And finally, the last way to vegetatively propagate orchids would be via meristem tissue culture. I know tissue culture is scary, children. Not really. When you tissue culture a lot of plants, you want to get the meristem, which is basically the undifferentiated growth tip of the plant. If you're looking at a plant from above, you know, the meristem would be, if it's a single... One second, let me actually demonstrate this with something. Okay, I finally found a dicot in the house. Pretty much everything else is a monocot. Not that monocots don't have meristems, but it's easier to see the meristem on a dicot. So you have your stem growing. The meristem would be this thing right here. It's the growth point. In this case, it's the bud that's popping up. It's basically where you can expect new growth to come from. So you have apical meristems and you have axial meristems, which... You can see the meristem right in the node there. So what the axial, the axial meristem would be good for this type of plant. If this plant were to get damaged right about here, this would take over as the main growth point. And that's what it's good for. And if it's a plant that's prone to branching, which the avocado eventually will do, that is what you can do. And there are a couple advantages to meristems when you tissue culture. One, they are really easy to remove and clean. Oftentimes the parts that you want, even though it's a very, very small mass of cells you can barely see, will be surrounded by other cells that are easily sterilized, so the inner meristem will be completely sterile, so you don't have contamination issues. And you don't have to work as hard to get the cells to de-differentiate and grow into new plant material, because they are already undifferentiated for the purpose of growing into whatever the heck the plant needs to grow. It's a little bit harder to find the meristem of an orchid. The best thing for orchids is to extract the meristem from a flower stalk. And people who are producing orchids and want to clone an orchid will oftentimes test flower the orchid. So they'll grow the orchids from crosses or from, cultivars and whatever else from seed. And then once the plants reach flowering age, they'll watch everybody flower, and the plants that flower in a way they desire, well, the next time it flowers, they will cut off the flower stalk. It's best to use flower stalk material that is still pretty young, so once it's past flowering, unless it's putting out new buds, you shouldn't use it. But what they will do, and with some species like Phalaenopsis, where the nodes of the flower stalk are very clearly seen, it's all these little kinks in that flower stalk, they will remove the entire flower stalk, surface sterilize it, and every node basically has a meristem that you can then put into special tissue culture media, and it will basically clone the orchid for you. And that's how you vegetatively tissue culture orchids. yeah, tissue culture is not just for orchid seeds. So that's the gist of vegetatively reproducing orchids. And it's a fun thing to do, and it can be done